may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
The disrespect is unreal here. I mean, all of these wide receivers, I think, represent great values right now in fantasy drafts. Of course, we're going to dive into each guy, and I'm going to talk about exactly why I think they are great values. And the first thing I need to say is, of course, we're not projecting them to be top 12 wide receivers. Of course, we are not projecting them to be the wide receiver ones on their own NFL offenses. But you don't have to be the wide receiver one on your own NFL offense. You don't have to be a top 12 wide receiver to be a hit in fantasy drafts, especially when all these guys are going as wide receiver 47, as wide receiver 51, as wide receiver 39. I mean, they are extremely cheap right now, where even if they are top 36 wide receivers, if they're just wide receiver threes, they represent great values. And let me give my case. Let me go through and explain each and every one. But please, guys, go down there, go to that comment section. And if I say anything you disagree with in this video, if I say anything that sounds stupid to you, please say it in the comment section, because there are going to be other people down there wondering the same thing. And if you give your input, I'm sure that we can all work together and we can all come to a better conclusion than just me up here talking and nobody else giving their own input down there. And if you have any other players you think are being disrespected, of course, leave that in the comment section. Drop a like while you're over there. Subscribe to the channel as we gear up for this fantastic football season. And let's bring up our first wide receiver here. Let's talk about Michael Gallup. Okay, so I sent out a tweet the other day, and this came after we wrote the Michael Gallup breakdown for our 2021 draft guide, because you go through and you look at Michael Gallup, and I was looking at that 2019 season, and I went, well, I love Amari Cooper. I mean, Amari Cooper's been a wide receiver that we've been higher than consensus on way too many times. I mean, it has not worked out nearly enough for us with how high we have been on Amari Cooper. And here, Michael Gallup, not many people remember. In 2019, Michael Gallup had more targets and more receiving yards on a per game basis compared to Amari Cooper. And a lot of people went down to the comment section of that tweet and said, well, Mason, look what happened in 2020. Mason, you idiot. Michael Gallup's not better than Amari Cooper. And of course that's the case. I have an Amari Cooper jersey behind us. I love Amari Cooper. But all we are trying to demonstrate with that tweet is showing the type of talent Michael Gallup is, and if he has the role that we want to see on this Dallas Cowboys offense, he can command volume. And no, this is not the same situation as it was in 2019, which is why he's being drafted as the wide receiver 47 in fantasy drafts right now. Michael Gallup is being drafted as a low-end wide receiver 4, high-end wide receiver 5, dependent on what you have with your own draft. And if you follow that draft guide coming out over on Patreon, if you follow out our Patreon rankings for this upcoming season, you're going to be drafting Michael Gallup a lot, because we actually have him ranked as the wide receiver 38. So essentially a full round ahead of consensus, maybe even 2 rounds ahead of consensus. And I think that this is a conservative ranking, to be honest. I think this is going to be a player that you are guaranteed to see rise in fantasy value as we get closer to this season and as more people wake up to see the talent Michael Gallup is. Now, you go through, he's 25 years old, coming up on his final year in his rookie deal. So he's playing under a contract year, which is mainly a narrative that I don't want to buy in too much. I'd rather just go through and look at what we have actually seen from Michael Gallup so far in his NFL career. And this is a player that got drafted in the 3rd round of that 2018 NFL draft class. He has the size you want to see for a wide receiver to get targeted at a heavy rate in the NFL. 6'1", 205 pounds. I mean, he was very productive in college. He was actually a very good college wide receiver prospect coming into the NFL, known for his route running. He gets to the NFL, and his rookie season, very disappointing. I mean, in 2018, he actually finishes as the wide receiver 96 in points per game with 6.11. I mean, he does get targeted at a heavy clip, which is surprising. He gets slightly over 5 targets a game this season, but only 31 receiving yards a game. And the reason why he was so far down in fantasy points scored is he was actually operating way under expectation for what you were having with his overall touchdown volume. Touchdown volume, we know, something that is not predictive season to season. We understand that it is so volatile. It's just going to go up and down, and you chase those targets, you chase those yards. And here he actually only had 0.13 touchdowns per game in 2018. So that really held him back from even being a wide receiver 5 in fantasy this year. But in 2019, this is the season of Michael Gallup. This is the season he comes out, breaks out, and shows what he can be in fantasy, where he averages 15.19 points per game. that was good for the wide receiver 18. So he was the definition of a mid wide receiver 2 in fantasy in 2019. This is his second season in the NFL. This is not some player that's been around for 5 years, finally gets a chance to be a starter, then he posts a random wide receiver 2 season. No, this is a breakout for Michael Gallup right here. And he does this with that volume. He gets over 8 targets a game, 79 receiving yards a game, and the touchdowns do go back in the positive direction where he averages 0.43 touchdowns per game. Now, what's notable and what we talked about at the beginning of this video is if you compare this same season with Amari Cooper, and what you love to see is both of these wide receivers healthy the entire year. And this is a full season sample. This is 16 games with Dak Prescott. I actually think it was 14 for Amari, 15 for Michael Gallup, but still the point remains, this is pretty much a full season sample. And between the two wide receivers, Gallup slightly over 8 targets a game. Amari Cooper about 7.5. Now, yards per game, Michael Gallup close to 80, Amari Cooper close to 75. And no, let me tell everybody going to the comment section to tell me how stupid I am and Michael Gallup is not better than Amari Cooper. I understand. Of course, Michael Gallup is not better than Amari Cooper. There's a reason Michael Gallup's the wide receiver 47 in drafts this season. But I think a lot of people are hyper-focusing in on that very small sample that we had with Dak Prescott this past year, because that 5-game sample is kind of determining all draft prices right now for these Dallas wide receivers in fantasy. And I'm not even trying to say Amari Cooper or CeeDee Lamb are overvalued their own right, because you can easily see Michael Gallup coming out and playing in an offense that is giving him over 80% of the snaps if they decide to run more 3 wide receiver sets. And we have already heard that Michael Gallup may be used a little bit more in the slot this upcoming season. And on top of this, everybody can see the Dallas Cowboys going out there and leading the NFL in passing yards. Both of those things are possible. So with Michael Gallup in that 5-game stretch with Dak Prescott, this is what a lot of people are pointing at. This is why his fantasy value is so down there. But Amari Cooper was the wide receiver 11. CeeDee Lamb was the wide receiver 16. And Michael Gallup was the wide receiver 43 in points per game. So yes, you don't love the small sample that we have with all 3 wide receivers and Dak Prescott last year. But what's also important to do is just look at the entire season and what happened. Let's look at how these players finished the year last year. And in this sample, which is slightly larger, this is after their bye week, after week 10, you actually have Amari Cooper as the wide receiver 31, Michael Gallup as the wide receiver 36, and CeeDee Lamb as the wide receiver 41. So you go through and you look at all of this. You look at the fact that Michael Gallup has been a mid-wide receiver 2 before in year 2 of his NFL career. You look at the fact that last year he was kind of in line outside of that 5-game sample with Dak Prescott, which is extremely important. And of course we have to admit that, but he was in the same realm of both Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb. So I think this draft price of him being the wide receiver 47 in fantasy literally makes 0 sense. I mean, if I drafted, and this is where he was going every single draft, I may have over a 50% exposure mark to Michael Gallup across all of my fantasy teams this upcoming year, because he's easily one of the best values in wide receiver, even if CeeDee Lamb or Amari Cooper don't get injured. But we also have to talk about the possibility of what happens if CeeDee Lamb has a high ankle sprain in week 2. What happens if Amari Cooper tears his ACL in week 5? All of a sudden, if either one of those wide receivers goes down for a significant portion of time, then you have Michael Gallup stepping up into a role where, I mean, it's going to be 2019 all over again. It's going to be Michael Gallup top 24 guaranteed wide receiver season. And even if that doesn't happen, you can easily see Michael Gallup being a wide receiver 3 on an offense that should be top 3 in passing yards. So Gallup going at wide receiver 47 makes no sense. Please target this guy in your drafts. And if you don't think you should be doing that, let me know in the comment section why. But I need a good argument. I just can't hear, Mason, you're stupid. Now, let's go to a player that we talked about in a video the other day. Let's talk about Russel Gage here. And Russel Gage, someone that right now is going as the wide receiver 51 in fantasy drafts. And if you look over there at our rankings on Patreon, which will be posted very soon, we actually have him as the wide receiver 42. Now, what's surprising about Russel Gage is I thought he was a little bit older. I don't know why. I thought he was 27, 28, but he is only 25 years old. And then you go through, and the first thing we have to admit with Russel Gage, and I actually wrote this in the chapter about Russel Gage in that draft guide, is it's a little bit scary given that we are drafting this situation. We are not drafting the player here. I mean, when you're drafting Michael Gallup, you're making a bet on the player, the talent, and saying if the situation has anything to change it, he can be a smash in fantasy. Here, this is a little bit of a different scenario because with Russel Gage, you're making a bet just on the situation alone because he was a very, very bad prospect coming out of LSU. This is why in that same draft class with Michael Gallup, I mean, Russel Gage actually was drafted with the 20th pick in the 6th round. He doesn't have great size, 6 foot, 186 pounds, and he had absolutely no production at LSU in college. And we know that production in college is the #1 correlation to actually having success at the NFL level. And if you look at his raw stats so far through 2 years, in 2019 and 2020, neither year is that impressive for Russel Gage on the whole. I mean, here in 2019, he was the wide receiver 89 in points per game. In 2020, he was the wide receiver 49 in points per game. Now, what's notable in both of these scenarios is he is at either 0.25 touchdowns per game or less in both seasons, which we know should positively regress in the coming years. So, taking that into account, but more importantly, looking at what happened in games where Russel Gage was playing a considerable amount of snaps last year. Now, obviously, it's complicated to go through and just try to look at splits with Russel Gage in games Julio Jones did play, Julio Jones didn't play, or same thing with Calvin Ridley. I think what's a lot easier is going, okay, well, with no Julio Jones here, with Russel Gage being the wide receiver 2 on this offense, we can all agree that Russel Gage is going to be seeing over 70% of the snaps for this Atlanta Falcons offense this upcoming season. So why not we just look at the games from last year that Russel Gage actually played over 70% of the snaps? And if you do that, I mean, you pull it up, Russel Gage actually averaged 15.37 points per game in that sample, and it's a decent size sample as well. This isn't very small. And then he was the wide receiver 19 in points per game with that mark. So Russel Gage here last year, based on the situation, based on how many targets were available when either Julio Jones or Calvin Ridley missed time, Russel Gage stepped into a role where he was able to come out and he was able to be a low-end wide receiver 2 in fantasy. Now, no, we're not going to have him ranked there. Like I've already stated, this is a wide receiver going as the wide receiver 51. He's being drafted as a wide receiver 5. He's being drafted right now behind Darnell Mooney, Devonta Parker, Mike Williams, and I actually just took him in the 9th round of one of our most recent mock drafts. And I made that pick and I went, well, yeah, that's gross. I don't like it. Maybe we would take that pick back if we had more time. Obviously, we're live streaming and everything. And then I went back and I reviewed that mock draft after we got done. And I actually really like the pick. I can't believe he's going behind Mooney, Parker, and Mike Williams in drafts. I think that he's a clear choice to go ahead of them, given the fact that there are going to be a significant amount of targets this upcoming season, even though we can fully admit this is not a player with a ton of talent. Now, our next guy, someone that we also just talked about, but I have to highlight him here a little bit more in depth. Let's talk about Curtis Samuel, who's going in to this season as the wide receiver 39 in ADP. And what's crazy is Curtis Samuel still has not turned 25 years old. Now, yes, he'll be 25 before the season starts, but he's incredibly young for a wide receiver that came out in that 2017 draft class. And you go through, and with Samuel, this is a dynamic player that literally has elite athleticism. I mean, he ran a 4.31 40-yard dash at the NFL Combine. That's in the range of Henry Ruggs. And the difference between the two is Curtis Samuel has been hyper-productive in the NFL before. Now, we go through, and in 2018 and 2019, yeah, it was pretty bad. He was a low-end wide receiver 4 in both seasons. It's going to be hard to take too much away from that. But we can say that with Curtis Samuel, this is a wide receiver that was drafted mainly for his athleticism, mainly for his raw traits, rather than what he was going to be in the NFL right away. So it would make sense that it takes him a little bit longer to go through and actually break out. And in 2020, that's what you had. You had a Curtis Samuel breakout at 24 years old, where he came out and he was the wide receiver 27 in points per game with 14.14 points per game. And I know you actually probably saw this circulating around Twitter over the past week, but we tweeted out originally. We were the first person to do it. And of course, we have some copycats coming in, having to steal our tweet. But anyway, it is crazy to see Curtis Samuel, Robbie Anderson, DJ Moore, all back to back in fantasy points per game this past season. Curtis Samuel was actually at the top of that list, followed by Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore. And that's kind of crazy to say because you look at the draft prices of all these guys. Curtis Samuel is clearly the cheapest option. It's not even close. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that we have to put this stuff in context. And I know a lot of people are going to be saying, well, Mason, he's going to Washington. He's playing alongside Terry McLaurin. Do you not understand that Terry McLaurin's going to get every single target on this offense? Terry McLaurin is our god. Terry McLaurin is the best player to ever play football. Well, guys, I hate to break it to you, but we have seen both of these players on the same team before. We talked about this in the video yesterday, and I understand a lot of people are not going to want to hear it. And I'm not saying this is everything. Of course, we have Terry McLaurin ranked higher than Curtis Samuel in drafts this upcoming year, but we have to do everything we can to look at this through a range of outcomes. We have to look at this with some context behind it. And the last time both of these wide receivers were on the same team was in college at Ohio State, where Curtis Samuel, at a younger age than Terry McLaurin. Curtis Samuel's younger than Terry McLaurin. I know that's crazy to hear, given Terry McLaurin was in the 2019 draft class compared to Curtis Samuel being in the 2017 draft class. But McLaurin, I mean, he took forever to develop coming out of college. That's why I'm a little bit uncertain that he can take some magical jump going into his age 26 season. But regardless, looking at this, Curtis Samuel actually had over 1,500 yards here, over 860 receiving yards, over 770 rushing yards this season. And on the other hand, you had Terry McLaurin actually behind some other NFL wide receivers in the pecking order here. Noah Brown was second on this team in receiving yards. Then you have Paris Campbell slightly ahead of McLaurin as well. But Terry McLaurin, 114 receiving yards this season. That is notable. You can look at that as a valid statistic to point out. And now down there, looking at his contract as well. I mean, talk about a wide receiver getting a massive deal. This is a wide receiver that came out and got paid $34 million. And of course, you can't just look at the overall numbers. I hate when people don't understand the context of these NFL contracts and they're too lazy to really dive in to what actually matters. And here with Curtis Samuel, what matters is the total guaranteed money that he got. And he got $23 million across 3 years. And even if they decide to move on from him in 2023, the last year of his contract, he has $7.2 million on the dead cap. So this is a significant contract that Curtis Samuel got. And what tells us this is the fact that they are committed to him in the long term. And this is most likely going to be a situation where they have a plan for him right away. You don't give a player this kind of money and then don't know how to use him. So Curtis Samuel is going to be in the plans for this team, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 39, finished as the wide receiver 27 at 24 years old last year. I really like this value with Curtis Samuel. I'd way rather draft Curtis Samuel at a discount compared to Terry McLaurin ahead of Keenan Allen, Michael Thomas, Allen Robinson. I mean, that's crazy. Now, thank you, my dudes. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. And of course, go down there, drop that like, leave that comment, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a ton. And I'll see y'all with the video tomorrow. Thank you so much for everyone joining the flock in Will, Wesley, Ethan, Sabres, Jonah, Austin, Andrew, Doug, Brandon, and Adam. Thank you so much, my dudes.